drive through it and you feel it before you see anything. The walls close in to maybe half a meter on each side of your car. The ceiling is raw rock, uneven and low, scarred with the marks of the tools that made it. The floor drops at a steep angle ahead of you, into darkness, and every few dozen meters there is an opening in the left wall. Sometimes round, sometimes square, sometimes just a rough gash in the stone. And through those openings the cliff drops away for hundreds of meters, and the valley of the Taihang Mountains hangs in the air beside you like something you are not supposed to be able to see from this angle. The tunnel is 1.2 kilometers long, 5 meters tall, 4 meters wide, no guardrails, no lighting. The road follows the path of least resistance through the rock, which is to say it twists and dips wherever the mountain permitted, not wherever a designer would have chosen. Locals call it the road that does not tolerate mistakes. Most accidents happen when a driver loses concentration, looking at the views through the windows. There are more than 30 of those windows, every one a different shape. Round in some places, square in others, wide horizontal gashes in others, the occasional rough oval where the stone broke at an angle nobody planned for. No two are alike. No document explains why. The men who made them left no records, and the decisions that produced each individual shape were made in the dark, in the middle of other problems, by people who were not thinking about windows at all. We get to that. But first, how 13 farmers with no engineering training and no government support ended up inside a mountain in 1972 with 4,000 hammers and nowhere to be but through it. The village of Guoliang sits on a cliff at 1,700 meters in the Taihang Mountains of Henan Province, central China. It has been there for roughly 2,000 years, or more, depending on which history you trust. The name comes from a rebel general of the Han Dynasty, a man called Guoliang, who led a peasant uprising against imperial forces, used these same mountains to hold off armies that should have destroyed him, and eventually settled his followers in the cliffs above the valley below. The terrain that protected him from the empire became the terrain that protected and trapped everyone who came after. Think about what 2,000 years of that means. 2,000 years of a village that could only be reached by a single path in the cliff face. Every generation of children born there grew up knowing the path intimately, which step was narrower than it looked, which stretch was most dangerous after rain, where to step and where not to. Every generation of men carrying goods down to trade and up from buying knew exactly what their body could manage on the sky ladder, because the sky ladder was the only calculation that mattered. The sky ladder itself was 720 steps cut into the pink stone of the cliff face, built according to local records during the Song dynasty, roughly 1,000 years ago. No railings. Width that narrowed in places to 40 centimeters, barely enough for a sideways foot. A person carrying anything had to hold it in their arms rather than on their back, because you needed your hands for the rock. A pig had to be kept under 50 or 60 kilograms at slaughter, because anything heavier could not be managed on the descent. This was not an occasional inconvenience. This was the constraint that governed every economic decision the village made for a millennium. You could not bring a large piece of machinery up the sky ladder. You could not bring a seriously ill person down it quickly. You could not bring in building materials in any meaningful volume or take out agricultural goods in any quantity that would make real trade possible. The village had stone. The entire place was built from it, houses and walls and tables and benches all carved from the same Taihang limestone. And it had whatever it could grow or raise on the limited ground above the cliff. That was the economy. That was all it was ever going to be, as long as the sky ladder was the only way in or out. Song Bao Kun, a villager who was a young man when the tunnel was built and who was still living in Guoliang decades later, described it simply: it was a tough life. Goods from the outside world could not reach the village. Fresh farm products could not be transported anywhere else. The weight limit on pigs was not an abstraction. It was something you thought about every time you fed an animal, calibrating its size against the moment you would need to carry it down 720 steps. The hardest constraint was medical. If a villager fell seriously ill, 8 people had to carry a stretcher down the sky ladder. Just the descent. 8 people, a stretcher, 720 steps with no railings, a cliff on one side and a drop on the other, in whatever weather the Taihang had decided to produce that day. Then 4 more hours to reach the nearest hospital by road. Many people who needed urgent medical care did not make it. The number has never been officially tallied because no one official was paying attention to a village of 300 people on a cliff in Henan province. But every family in Guoliang knew what it meant when someone got sick. By the 1960s and early 1970s, the village was starting to empty. The young were leaving, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The calculation that most inhabitants were running quietly in their heads, the one that said, "The plains are easier, the cities have work. Why stay on a cliff where everything is harder, and one bad harvest means real hunger?" Most of the 300 residents had at some point considered going. Some had gone. The village knew it needed a road. For years before 1972, the elders had sent requests to the local government. Something official, something funded, something built by people who knew how to build things. The requests came back refused. The government had other priorities, other problems, other places. A village of 300 on a cliff in the Taihang Mountains was, to the administrative apparatus of Henan province in the late 1960s and early 1970s, apparently not a problem worth the cost of solving. So in 1972, a man named Shen Mingxin made a different calculation. Shen Mingxin was the village chief, not an elected official in any Western sense, more the person the village had determined was responsible for its collective decisions, a farmer like everyone else, with no engineering background of any kind. He had watched the requests go in and the refusals come back. He had watched the village shrink. He had presumably watched people be carried down the sky ladder on stretchers and not come back. And at some point, in a process that no account has preserved in detail, he arrived at a conclusion that was either obvious or insane, depending on how you looked at it. If the government would not build the road, the village would build it themselves. Not the sky ladder widened or reinforced, not a cable lift or a better path, a road through the side of the mountain, wide enough for a vehicle. Think about what that decision actually meant. Shen Mingxin was not a man with engineering training deciding to apply his skills to an unusual problem. He was a farmer with no relevant knowledge deciding to attempt something that had no precedent anywhere nearby. The budget would come from selling livestock and crops from households that were already poor. The labor would come from the strongest men in a village that could not easily spare them from agricultural work. If it failed, if the mountain proved unworkable, or the money ran out, or the men who had sold their animals to buy tools came back with nothing, the village would be poorer and no closer to a road than before. He put the proposal to the village. 13 men volunteered. They pooled what they had. They sold goats. They sold crops. They sold Chinese yam, which was the village's best trade good on the rare occasions it could be moved down the sky ladder in manageable quantities. They took the proceeds to a blacksmith and had 12 tons of steel rods forged into chisels and drill bits. They bought 4,000 hammers, and in 1972, they started. The work moved at a meter every 3 days at the hardest points. Song Bao Kun described it later in simple terms. One person held the steel rod, and two people hammered on it. They dug 1 meter every 3 days, and every 3 days they blasted open another hole. That was the rhythm. Hold, hammer, swap, reposition the rod, hammer again, move the broken stone. Hold, hammer, swap. The technique was the same one humans had been using to cut stone for thousands of years, because there was no other technique available to men without machinery. The dust from the limestone filled the air and the eyes and the lungs and settled on everything, and there was no ventilation beyond whatever wind found its way in from outside. In the first months, before the tunnel was deep enough for the problem to become critical, the broken stone was piled behind the men as they advanced. The pile grew. The working space shrank. This was the problem nobody had solved before they started. The rubble, a hammer and chisel operation in solid rock, produces roughly its own volume in broken stone that has to leave the space before the work can continue. In a professional tunnel operation, there are skips, conveyor belts, carts on rails, engineered extraction systems. In a 4-meter-wide bore carved by farmers in 1972, there was nothing. The broken rock accumulated behind the men as they advanced, and at some point, the accumulation would fill the tunnel completely, and the work would stop. Shen Mingxin's solution was not elegant. It was desperate. He told the men to punch holes through the cliff face. Not windows, not anything as deliberate as a window. Just holes. Wherever the rubble had piled past what they could manage by hand, wherever the pressure was worst, a man would redirect his efforts sideways and punch an opening to the outside. The broken stone would be thrown through it. The work would continue. The hole stayed open because there was no reason to close it and no material to close it with. The holes are different shapes because the men made them wherever the rock permitted, not wherever a plan required. Round where the stone fractured cleanly, square where someone measured carefully enough to care. Wide gashes where patience ran out and the work needed to move. Each one records a specific moment of necessity, a specific decision by a specific man whose name is not attached to it. No window is like any other window, because no 2 days that produced them were alike. At the tightest points, where the cliff face angled outward and no amount of improvised exits could solve the problem from inside, the men lowered themselves on ropes outside the cliff to chip the footing for the next section from the vertical face, suspended above a drop of hundreds of meters on hand-knotted rope, chiseling the beginning of the next meter of progress, while the Taihang Valley spread out in silence below them. A falling chisel at those points fell freely for 200 meters before it hit anything. So did a man. The progress was slowest in winter, when the cold made the rock harder and the hands less reliable. In the second winter, the temperature inside the tunnel dropped below freezing, and the water seeping through the limestone froze on the walls. The men worked in gloves when they could, but gloves made it harder to feel the rod against the rock, harder to control the swing, harder to do the work. So mostly they worked without. Several villagers died during construction. The number is contested. Some sources say one, others say several. What is consistent across every account is the sentence that follows: the tunnel progressed at the same pace after each death as it had before. There was no ceremony recorded, no formal mourning period. The work was what the village had decided to do, and stopping was not part of the decision. The men who had sold their animals to buy the tools understood what they had committed to. They kept going. Somewhere around the 3rd year, other villagers started joining. Not the original 13, the village around them. Women carried stone from the tunnel entrance down the cliff. Older men whose hands were not strong enough for the drilling maintained the tools, reforging blunted chisels, checking the ropes, keeping the hammers from cracking. Children were told what the tunnel was for and watched it grow from outside. measuring its progress in whatever unit made sense to a child watching a hole in a mountain get slowly larger. The project had become what Shenming-shin had presumably needed it to become. Not something that 13 people were doing, but something the village was doing. The thing that is not in any of the official accounts of the Guoliang Tunnel is the specific moment when the project crossed from an act of pragmatism into an act of defiance. In 1972, China was in the 5th year of the Cultural Revolution. The economy was in deep disruption. The political logic of the state was pointed at cities and industry, at ideological conformity, at the relentless pressure of collective production targets. A village of 300 people in the Taihang Mountains asking for a road was not merely ignored. It was ignored by a system that had decided, structurally and explicitly, that rural infrastructure outside the state plan was someone else's problem, or nobody's problem, or a problem that would eventually solve itself. The government had said no, not once, not reluctantly, but repeatedly over years. The choice to proceed anyway, to spend the village's own savings on tools, to use the village's own bodies for labor, to build the thing the state had declined to build, was not just practical. In the China of 1972, that choice carried a weight that Shenming-shin and every man who picked up a hammer understood very well. They were doing, collectively and visibly, something the state had told them not to do. They were solving their own problem with their own resources. This was not the Cultural Revolution's preferred mode of rural existence. The fact that they were not punished for it, that the project was eventually acknowledged and even celebrated by the same government apparatus that had refused to fund it, tells you something about the pragmatic limits of ideological enforcement in a mountain village far from anyone who could be bothered to care. But the risk was real while the work was happening. Shenming-shin was not a naive man. He had sent the requests to the government. He knew what the refusals meant and why they had come. He had made his calculation. This is the second part of the answer to why. The first part is that people were dying on the sky ladder and dying in transit to hospitals they reached too late, and the village needed a road. The second part is that the village had been told by the apparatus of the state that it did not deserve one, and it built one anyway. On May 1, 1977, the tunnel opened, May Day, in a communist country. That date was not chosen by accident. The one day of the year when the meaning of labor was officially and publicly sanctioned. When the state celebrated the working class, it had declined to help build a road. Whether Shenming-shin chose the date deliberately, or whether it simply fell that way after 5 years of work has not been recorded. The effect was the same. The village had done in 5 years what the provincial government had refused to do with all the resources of an administrative apparatus. They had done it with hammers and chisels and rope and the proceeds from selling their animals. The tunnel was 1.2 kilometers of raw, uneven, windowed, irregular rock, and it was wide enough for a vehicle, and it connected Guoliang to the outside world for the first time in 2,000 years of continuous habitation. There was no ceremony in the state press. The tunnel was not celebrated by the government that had refused to build it. The men who built it did not receive any commendation preserved in any archive, accessible in any language other than local memory. What happened was quieter and more permanent than a ceremony. Vehicles started going in and out. Pigs could be full-sized at slaughter. Sick people could get to hospitals. The thing that had always been impossible had become ordinary. Then something stranger happened. In the 1990s, a Japanese film studio visited the Taihang Mountains looking for locations. They found Guoliang. They filmed it. They called the tunnel the 9th wonder of the world, the 8th in some accounts, and the footage circulated. Photographers came, filmmakers came. Over 40 films and television dramas have been shot in and around the village since. More than 1 million visitors a year now navigate the tunnel that no tunnel engineer would have designed, precisely because no tunnel engineer designed it. The government that had declined to build a road to Guoliang eventually built one. A proper road, safe and sensible, connecting the village by a route that tour buses use. Most tourists drive up on the proper road, then drive through the tunnel, then take the proper road back down. The tunnel is the attraction. The safe road is the infrastructure. The government built the infrastructure for a tourist destination it had refused to build a road for, when it was just a village of 300 people who were dying, trying to get sick relatives to hospitals. Song Baokun's sons, who had left for the cities when they were young because the cliff had nothing to offer them, came back after the tourists started arriving. His son Shen Zhenfu said later, "When we were little, we didn't even have enough to eat. All I wanted was to go to the big cities. Now, I don't think that way anymore." And another villager, Shen Heshen, said the thing that closes the whole story. In the past, hungry villagers envied those living on the plains. Now nobody wants to leave this clifftop village. We feel good about our home. That is what the tunnel did. It did not just solve the problem of getting in and out. It changed what the village was. The same isolation that had made Guoliang a slow death for 2,000 years became, once there was a road through it, the reason people came from across the world to stand on a cliff at 1,700 meters and look at a mountain with holes punched through it. By the time the work was done, there were more than 30 holes in the cliff face. More than 30 different shapes and sizes, each one the record of a day when the rubble problem got worse than the men could manage, and the only solution was to open the mountain. No one planned for them to let in light. No one planned for them to frame views of the valley below that would stop tourists 50 years later in the middle of a narrow tunnel and make them forget they were supposed to keep moving. No one planned for them to become the thing that makes the Guoliang Tunnel unlike any other tunnel on Earth. They were made because the broken rock had to go somewhere. That is the whole answer to the mystery of the windows. Drive the tunnel today, and you will probably stop the car at one of them. Everyone does. You will look through the hole, through the exact hole that a man punched with a hammer and chisel, because the broken rock had piled up to his knees, and there was nowhere else for it to go. And the cliff will drop away in front of you, and the valley of the Taihang will be so far below that the trees look like texture rather than individual things. The wall around the window is rough and unfinished. You can see exactly where the hammer struck, and where the chisel found the fault line, and where the stone gave way. That is not the mark of craftsmanship. It is the mark of a problem being solved by the fastest method available, by a man who needed this particular rock gone so he could keep working. The whole tunnel is like this. It does not pretend to be anything other than what it is. The record of a decision made by a man named Shen Mingxin in 1972, executed by 13 people with no qualifications, sustained by an entire village for 5 years, completed because there was no version of the situation in which stopping made more sense than continuing. No engineer designed it. No government funded it. No plan predicted its shape. The windows are not a design feature. They are 30-plus individual moments of desperation made permanent in stone. Each one the record of a day when the rubble won, and the only answer was to open the mountain to the air. That they turned out to be beautiful is not something anyone planned. The sky ladder is still there. 720 steps in the pink stone, cut into the cliff 1,000 years before the tunnel existed. You can climb it if you want. At the top, on a clear morning, the clouds sit below the level of the cliff edge, and the Taihang Valley disappears under white, and the village is above the weather, as it has always been. It is still the only reason anyone knows Guoliang exists.